Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lori Myers, and I'm moderating today's panel on why anti-Semitism has gone mainstream and what we can do to push back. A little about me. I am a founding board member of BACA, the Bay Area Center to Counter Anti-Semitism. Our mission is to support the incredible work of the Bay Area grassroots groups who have formed since October 7th to fight anti-Semitism on the front lines in their cities, schools, and communities. I know and I see a whole bunch of grassroots leads and volunteers in the crowd right now. Thank every one of you for the work that you're doing. You are keeping us all safe. I'm also the co-lead of one of those grassroots groups, the Palo Alto Jewish Alliance, and we are working hard right here in Palo Alto, where we are sitting today, to make sure that Palo Alto stays a safe place of belonging for the Jewish community. And when I'm not fighting anti-Semitism, I'm the assistant principal of teaching and learning at South Peninsula Hebrew Day School. All right, I like that. So we have an incredible panel today, but before we get started, I want to take a quick poll from the audience. So get your hands ready. Raise your hand if you personally have experienced anti-Semitism over the past 2 years. It could be at work, on social media, at Starbucks, anywhere. Okay, keep your hands up. Okay, raise your other hand if you know anyone who's experienced anti-Semitism over the past 2 years at Starbucks, at work, on social media, anywhere. Okay, now take a quick look around the room. Hands down. That's why today's panel is so important. We are experiencing anti-Semitism on the left and on the right. We're seeing it in places and spaces we never thought we would see anti-Semitism. I personally have experienced anti-Semitism on the right and on the left at the same city council meeting twice. Not a fun city council meeting. And in my advocacy work, I see anti-Semitism in K-12 education in grades as early as kindergarten and from sources as broad as lessons, teachers' unions, teacher professional associations, and more. I brought a quick example. I don't know if the camera's able to zoom in, and if you can't see it, I will show you afterward. This is a resource that was recommended by the Santa Clara County Board of Education in a training to teachers about 3 months ago. I'm just going to repeat that. From our local county Office of Education to teachers. And it says, this is for kindergartners. It's like a little coloring book. And it says, a group of bullies called Zionists wanted our land, so they stole it by force and hurt many people. So, our goal today is to understand why anti-Semitism has gone so mainstream, and for every single one of you to leave knowing at least one thing that you can do about it. And I can't think of two panelists more qualified to lead us in this conversation than the two we have here today. Isabella Tabarovsky is a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary anti-Semitism. She is a fellow with the Z3 Project, a contributing writer at Tablet Magazine, and the author of the forthcoming book, Be a Refusenik, A Jewish Student's Survival Guide. And Ethan Katz is a professor of modern Jewish history and director for the Center for Jewish Studies at UC-Berkeley, go Bears, where he also chairs the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Jewish Life. He is the co-founder of the Antisemitism Education Initiative and the Berkeley Bridging Fellowship, and the author or co-editor of 4 books, including The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France. So let's give a round of applause to our panelists. And now let's jump right in. To start us off, I'd love to hear from both of you. How are you seeing anti-Semitism going mainstream in your life and in your work? Isabella, can you lead us off?
Well, in my own life, so I live in Israel now, and I moved to Israel 5 years ago after having, first I grew up in the USSR, and then I moved to America. I lived in America for 30 years, and then I moved to Israel. So, but I'm involved in a lot of, in the academic community, kind of worldwide, that studies anti-Semitism. And so, you know, there are examples of colleagues getting pushed out, not getting jobs, you know, hearing that, I don't know, a Jewish studies center is thinking about becoming a Palestinian studies center. So these are things that are happening to my colleagues all the time. I was recently, last January, this was really my first experience ever. I was supposed to go to Finland. I wrote an article about it. I was supposed to go teach, offer a lecture in Finland at 2 universities. And then a campaign, an anonymous campaign started. I don't even want to call it pro-Palestinian because I don't think that these people are pro-Palestinian. They just wanted to prevent me from speaking. And they used, you know, the slogans. For me as an ex-Soviet Jew, it's especially ironic to really be targeted in this way because it's precisely why we left the Soviet Union. You know, that Zionism is racism, et cetera, she's a Zionist, therefore she's a racist. And so it was just a clearly, it's an anti-Semitic campaign. So it's pretty personal at this point.
Wow. Thank you, Isabella. Ethan, what about you?
Well, you know, I've been pretty fortunate in my own life to rarely encounter anti-Semitism. I have encountered it personally, I think 3 times in the last maybe 5 years. Twice very much connected to the events of the past 2 years. I would maybe slightly shift the question a little bit because I think that what we are seeing is the mainstreaming of 2 catalysts or often vessels for anti-Semitism. One is anti-Zionism from the left, has been mainstreamed to an astonishing degree. It didn't start on October 7th, but it has accelerated exponentially since then. And white nationalism, largely specifically white Christian nationalism from the right, has also been radically mainstreamed. And so what is striking to me is the avalanche of things that come across our radar, you know, ranging from the relative, you know, lack of concern about all kinds of demonization of Israel in many realms, to the, you know, series of chats, right, that were documented recently among a number of young right-wing activists, and the refusal of the Vice President of the United States to condemn these chats that were joking about Hitler and the Holocaust, among other things, right? So I think, I mean, it's these 2 sets of kind of larger ideologies in which anti-Semitism is so frequently embedded or central that are really accounting for what we see around us as a kind of mainstreaming of anti-Semitism.
So one of the things that you both have in common is that you've both studied how anti-Semitism has evolved over time. How is anti-Semitism now similar to what we've seen in the past, and how is it different?
Well, look, I've been writing for years now, starting in 2018, I think, when I first noticed this phenomenon, is how the anti-Zionist rhetoric in the United States is so, it's not just similar, it literally replicates the anti-Zionist rhetoric that we were familiar with in the Soviet Union. And so I spent years really tracking and exploring it and trying to understand, first of all, what was it really in the USSR that comprised this anti-Zionist rhetoric? What were the tropes? And the tropes go beyond just saying that Zionism is racism and Zionism is fascism and Israel is a genocidal apartheid state. All of that appears in Soviet propaganda. You know, 67 is when it really begins it becomes a flood of propaganda that goes out internationally, but it all appears even before then. But it also gets to things like, you know, we are not being anti-Semitic, we're just being anti-Zionist. Zionists collaborated with the Nazis in the annihilation of their own people in the Holocaust. Zionists are just trying to, there is no real problem with anti-Semitism. It's only Zionists who are inventing it so that they can deflect attention from criticism of Israel. So, all of these things that have become part of our life here in America were part of Soviet propaganda 50, 55 years ago, 60 years ago at this point. And once I understood it, I asked the question, well, it can't be that people today, that the left today, and today it goes beyond the left, the anti-Zionism is really everywhere. But how is it that it suddenly appeared here? Because you don't reinvent language like this from scratch. It's basically 100% correspondence. The only thing I would say that's new today is that some of the chants from the river to the sea, that's the new addition. Everything else is really borrowed from there. And I understood that there were channels of transmission, and there were many channels of transmission, because the USSR really was reaching out to the global left already in the early 70s and onward. And this language becomes part of far-left DNA, the far-left kind of thinking, conceptual universe already in the early 1970s. And I want to add, and this is something that I only understood recently. I used to say, and I used to think, well, this language just kind of lived there on the margins, and nobody really noticed it until now. It's only now coming to the mainstream because of polarization. But I only realized very recently that actually already in the 70s, people noticed it in the United States. American scholars, American Jewish professionals noticed it, raised the issue, said that anti-Zionism, literally in 1971, there is a 5,000-word essay in the New York Times where a Jewish sociologist says anti-Zionism is one of the most, it's the new form of anti-Semitism, it's one of the most dangerous forms of anti-Semitism that we are facing. And so the question that I have, and maybe we'll get to it later, is why is it that we were not paying attention then? And how is it that every time we have a new evolution, a new crisis, we feel like, wow, we've never heard this before. This is something new. But in fact, it's not new. It's not new for Soviet Jews, and it's actually not new for American Jews either.
Thank you, Isabella. I have a follow-up, but I want to hear from Ethan first.
Yeah, so I first just want to say, since we're sitting here on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, so my grandfather, my father's father, was arrested on Kristallnacht in Frankfurt 87 years ago today. And so for me, when I started working on anti-Semitism education 6 years ago, there was a very kind of shocking element to what I was encountering on campus, and a sense that my grandfather, who later was very involved in establishing the Holocaust Museum in St. Louis, where he lived, and his sister, Helen Waterford, who became a very widely sought speaker and wrote a book about her experiences surviving Auschwitz, that this was what they would have expected of my generation. And so I go looking as a historian and also within my own personal history for these questions about parallel and difference. I think the strong parallels are around catalysts for anti-Semitism that we see historically. If we look to the 19th century, if we look to the 1920s and 1930s, we see globalization, we see periods of tremendous economic instability and large wealth gaps and concentrations of wealth and power. We see periods of tremendous social cleavage. We see periods of larger sense of rise of ethno-nationalism and racialization. We see all of the kinds of anxieties and conspiracy theories that emerge in those times concentrating frequently around Jews and around anti-Semitism. We see that historically, and all those factors are present in spades today and have been really for at least a decade, I would say. So that is a very strong commonality, an element of continuity. I think that one of the big differences today, and I actually think it goes a little bit to the question that you just raised, Isabella, about why people weren't paying more attention. I think that two things that substantially insulated the American Jewish community from a sense of vulnerability. One was the rise, and for a time, tremendously widespread attention on Holocaust consciousness, which actually came late in terms of in relation to the tragedy of the Holocaust here, but it became in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s kind of omnipresent, and a period where we thought that the state of Israel was moving toward some kind of peaceful settlement and had basically achieved very widespread acceptance, and we didn't think we had to sort of question the future existence of the state of Israel. And we clearly are in a moment now that is profoundly broken from that period where Holocaust consciousness has receded, I think, quite dramatically, and we obviously are in a period where Israel is being treated as increasingly contingent and a subject of sort of feverish efforts at delegitimization. And so I think those have brought this sense of vulnerability much more to the surface and to the mainstream for our community.
So clearly we've seen this in the past, many times, and you both have cited like different times in history where we've seen this. How can we learn from what we've seen then in Soviet Union, in American history, in German history? How can we use what we learned then to fight anti-Semitism now?
So, we're still figuring that out really well. Otherwise, Isabel and I would do other things and make much more money.
We have 1 more hour to figure this out today, so let's get to it.
Right. Sorry. So 2 things that I will draw from my experience at Berkeley, and that I think are fundamentally important and that also speak to us from history. One is the creation of really intentional infrastructure meant to fight anti-Semitism. The Antisemitism Education Initiative that we established at Berkeley in 2019 was the first sort of homegrown educational initiative on any university campus anywhere, and it quickly became a model. I didn't establish that alone. I worked very closely with my colleague Stephen Davidoff-Solomon and Rabbi Adam Naftali Kalman, and it was a collaborative effort, which also speaks to the importance of collaboration in trying to build these institutions. So I think that's one really crucial thing. It's not just creating structures, it's creating relationships around them, it's creating programming around them, but all these things are things that many places wish they had done earlier, but we still can do them now. And the second thing is, I believe, figuring out ways to make these structures in our communities in as many dialogical relationships as possible. Historically, when Jews are most isolated, they are most vulnerable, and anti-Semitism is fought most widely and most effectively when it is understood to be the disease that it is for an entire society and not simply for Jews. And so we have to be able to build alliances. We have a program called the Berkeley Bridging Fellowship, which I hope I'll get to talk a little bit more about at Berkeley, where we bring together, last year it was 12, this year it's 24 undergraduates all year, very diverse, some of them Jewish or Israeli, some of them Palestinian or Muslim or Arab, to learn about the history and politics of Israel and Palestine and to learn how to talk across their differences. And then we try to use these to create ripples across our campus. And I think, these are very hard conversations. These are very hard alliances to contemplate, especially at a time like now. But I think we have to think about how to be dialogical and think about where we can find allies, because we need allies.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that allies are very important in fighting back on anti-Semitism. Isabel, I'm also very interested in what you think, given what you've seen recycling over and over and over again from the Soviet Union.
So I actually have the answer to this question. We don't need another hour because I already wrote a book about it. So the book is advertised on page 45 of your programs, and I hope that on November 20th you will all go and order it. That's when it comes out. No, I'm joking, of course. But so this goes right to the right to the answer, right to the question that Lori is asking. So the book is called "Be a Refusenik: A Jewish Student Survival Guide." So I wrote it when and I've been making this parallel parallels for a while. So we are not only living in an environment of, and I'm not afraid of this phrase, I mean cognitive warfare. I think that there is a cognitive warfare going on against Jews. We are being targeted as a people. Our children have been targeted. There are forces that are trying to separate us from our cousins in Israel. And I think it's pretty, there's different groups that are doing it, but I think it's pretty intentional. And, I started looking at the Soviet Jews lived in a very similar environment in that sense. Soviet anti-Zionism targeted Jewish peoplehood. Okay, it denied the Jews were a people. It said that Soviet Jews are separate from Jews in Israel, and they're separate from Jews in America. And so I started asking myself, well, how did Soviet Jews resist that? Because the part about Soviet Jewish history is that it's actually a story with a happy ending. It's a story in which a million and a half Jews regain their Jewish identity enough and their Zionist identity and their connection to Israel in a situation where it's completely not only forbidden, I mean, you can go to jail for it if you get particularly active doing that, proclaiming your Zionist identity. And they end up reconnecting with the Jewish people, right? They're having to emigrate ultimately in order to do it. But the emigration is only the final stage. For many, many years, what the refuseniks are doing, who are the refuseniks? The refuseniks are Soviet Jews, like Natan Sharansky, who apply to emigrate, they refuse the exit visa, and then they're marginalized from everything. They're pushed out of everything that's important to them because they're viewed as traitors. But there is more to this refusal, okay? Before they were refused the visa, they refused the state. They reject, not just the state, they refused the system, okay? They rejected the idea of that they should be assimilating into an anti-Semitic environment, that they should be accepting it, that they should be accepting anti-Semitic jokes, that they should be, that their careers and work professional situations and academic environments should be conditioned on their being good Jews, So in other words, being quiet, not really, essentially being what they expected to be. And so what I'm saying here, what I do in this book is I draw parallels with them, and I interviewed refuseniks, and I also interviewed some young American Jewish activists, some of whom are household names now, like Shabbos Kestenbaum, like Eyal Yacobi, like Adela Kochab. Some of them, by the way, began this fight years before October 7th. They were on the front lines years before, and they tried to attract the community's attention to what was going on campus, and they were being ignored. And so what I find there is I draw some lessons that I think they come out of sort of shared approaches, and these approaches are internal. So this is this was a very long way to say that I think before we can really fight anti-Semitism, I think we kind of need to go within, and I think we need to strengthen certain aspects of our identity that maybe have gone a little bit weak. So one thing that I say is that I think we need to reclaim our Zionism, and that we need to really not allow ourselves to be pushed into the corner with it. We shouldn't allow others to tell us how we should relate to Israel. Another lesson is that and again, these are lessons that both, right, you see it in both stories of 50 years ago in the USSR and of today among activists today. Another one is rejecting victimhood. We are really, in the previous session, there was a really good discussion with Benjamin Kirstein about how, the Holocaust part of our story has really dominated the American Jewish experience. We need to be adding the heroic aspect. We need to remember who are the heroes, who are the role models. And the refuseniks, by the way, I think are the role models for today. So these are just some of the lessons that I thought of and put in this book.
So these are amazing lessons, and I promise you that I will go out and buy your book, and everybody here will, but I need a little sneak peek into how do we do that? Like, I love the idea of reclaiming our Jewish identity. I love the idea of rejecting victimhood. How do we do that?
I mean, I think it's what we teach our children, right? I think it begins at home. I think it has to be part of what synagogues do and teach. I think it has to be part of Jewish education. look, I didn't grow up here, so it's a little bit hard for me to understand how Jewish education is structured. But what I do understand is that a lot of times in this country, people try to really walk this middle path or try to maybe sit on two chairs at the same time. Yes, we are Jews, we support Israel, but we're not so Zionist as to kind of inflame your fear of dual loyalty, etc. I actually think that proclaiming our connection to Israel is crucial. And so if you want practical steps, I think that going to Israel, creating connections to Israel, I think we need to learn to ignore, our conversation about Israel is very often, it boils down to just conversation and fights about politics. And I think we need to learn to, it's fine to talk about that, but our connection with Israel shouldn't depend on who is the prime minister and what is the coalition. I think there are deeper connections, and there obviously there's biblical connections, there ancient story, etc. But I think we should be connecting to modern Israel as well. I think we should be learning Hebrew because there's so much incredible culture that's created in Israel that's not being that's really inaccessible to so much of our community here in the United States. So these are the education. It's the education.
Education is so important. Ethan, you were talking about that also. Ethan, do you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I hear we might have a slight disagreement, Isabella. We're Jews.
That's what we like.
We're here to argue. So I agree with you very much that reclaiming Zionism is incredibly important for American Jewry. And I think part of how we have to do that is by really telling our story of how Zionism was a movement to establish Jewish self-determination, Jewish security in our ancient homeland, and how everything that Israel has given us and what Zionism was about. And that's a story that we're really not succeeding in many cases in telling the youngest generation successfully. But I think part of telling that story successfully actually goes back to this issue of not claiming victimhood as our central identity. Because part of what Zionism set out to do, and what I think many people do not understand very well today, is Zionism set out to end the notion of Jews as victims. In Amos Oz's wonderful memoir, A Tale of Love and Darkness, he tells the story of the night of the partition vote in 1947, lying with his father in bed. It's the only time he ever witnessed his father cry in his entire life as the vote was announced and as people celebrated in the street. And his father said to him, "Now you'll never be bullied again for being a Jew. That's all over." Now, if only, right? But it tells us something really powerful about what Zionism and the state was meant to achieve. And I think part of that, therefore, means taking responsibility for the reality of Jewish sovereignty and Jewish power, and telling a story that is credible, which means telling a story about the paradox of Israel, not apologizing for Israel, not apologizing for the establishment of the state, not apologizing for our love of Israel, but recognizing that the establishment of Israel also meant the displacement and victimization of another people, the Palestinians, and that's a problem that still has to be solved. And that part of the story of Zionism is also the story of that. Our young people do not find credible the story that excludes that. And part of the reason we are losing young people in our community is they come out of day school, they learn about the Palestinians, and they feel incredibly embittered and like they were betrayed. So we have to find a way to tell a story of Zionism and Israel that is a story of love and pride, but also a story that recognizes these contradictions and the messy reality that is that history and that is the future still to be paved better.
I actually don't disagree. I think that preparing our kids to go into college by telling them this story and recognizing how it is complex, it's better that we do it that way than for them to hear it in college from radicals for the first time and then feel completely unprepared and not knowing how to respond.
Absolutely. My husband and I last night met a couple of students on a gap year program, and I'm not remembering the name of the org, but they have a booth out on the Midrashov, and their entire mission is to go out and educate college students, Jewish and otherwise, on what really happened in 1948 and before, what's really happened since, so that they can have these difficult conversations from a foundation of fact and knowledge. And it's so important that our children and everybody understand the true history of what's happened in Israel, because then we're able to have a real conversation rather than something that's based on talking points and misleading information.
Well, and I just want to add that I think this is where, this is where it becomes, it's really fighting anti-Semitism. I think it begins with us, right? So let's say you know all the facts, let's say you know the story. There are people you will never be able to convince to come to your point of view. There are people who are pretty radical in their anti-Israel feelings, So, but as long as you understand the story, as long as you know the answers, you're already in a different place, right? And I think that that's really important.
Thank you. So we're seeing anti-Semitism on the right and the left, and some of the anti-Semitism is different and some of it is the same. So some of the things that I see in my work are Holocaust inversion, which is the notion that the Holocaust happened, but now Israel is perpetuating its own Holocaust, so conflating the two. I see a lot of co-opting and misusing words like genocide, which Hamas is a genocidal group, yet Israel is being accused of genocide. Words like apartheid, where as a Jew, I would not be able to go into Area A, and that is apartheid, yet Israel is being accused of apartheid, and so much more. And I'm wondering, how should our response and our proactive strategy to fighting anti-Semitism be different or the same, depending on whether it's coming from the left or from the right?
So, this is a hard question because there's so many different forms of anti-Semitism, and it's a shifting landscape. I think for a long time, many of us said we're really worried about anti-Zionism and particularly certain forms of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism on the left, but the lethal threat comes from the right. Right? We said that for a long time, and it was empirically true in this country that violence against Jews was almost entirely coming from the right. This is not the case anymore in the sense that it has come from the left as well in the last few years and just even in the last several months. And at the same time, I would say that the situation with anti-Israel rhetoric and sentiment and how we approach that is in many cases, I think, different than how we should approach the far right. Right-wing white nationalism is a movement that places a theory, replacement theory, at its center, and that theory says that the Jews are the great puppet masters, the Jews are the great controlling entity waging a race war against whites in America, and that therefore what they see as the problem of the size and strength of the African American community, of Muslims, of Latinos, at the end of the day, at the heart of that story is Jews. And if you look at the manifestos of the shooter in Christchurch in a mosque, attacks on Sikhs, a whole series of these. Eric Ward has done great work on this. And what you see is over and over again, people who attacked groups other than Jews, if you scratch the surface, their story, how they understand the world, is that Jews are the driving force behind what they sometimes call white replacement or even white genocide, right? That's a very difficult set of ideas with which to find any kind of common ground or any kind of dialogue, right? It's an eliminationist idea vis-a-vis Jews that are seen as a mortal threat to the white race. The range of ideas on the far left about anti-Zionism is a much kind of wider and I would say more complicated range of ideas. And so I think there we have to look for opportunities where we can sometimes enter into productive conversations. I see that in the work that we do in the Bridging Fellowship. I'm going to just give one example of a Palestinian student who was in the fellowship last year, someone who lost more than 30 family members in Gaza in this war, very involved in pro-Palestinian activism for their entire life. And they came into my History of Israel class, and they said to me a couple weeks into the class, you know, I am now understanding for the first time that Zionism could be also a national liberation movement for Jews. And I have to square that. I don't know what to do with that totally, because my experience of Zionism has been violence and pain and very different. And I said, well, that's what education is about, is wrestling with these complicated realities. And this person, wrestled with them throughout the year in their conversations and their relationships with people through our Bridging Fellowship. But I have to say that one of the things I think is crippling our community is fear of these conversations with people who cast themselves as pro-Palestinian. I can agree with you, Isabella, that many of them aren't necessarily pro-Palestinian when we get down to what they're calling for or their understanding of Hamas or their excuses for Hamas. But the fact of the matter is, I think it's a mistake to say I will not even speak to someone who uses the word apartheid. We now have a series of major scholars who are respected scholars of Holocaust and genocide who are saying what's going on in Gaza is a genocide. I don't have to believe that to say, let's stop saying everybody who uses that word is an anti-Semite, and let's engage the conversation, because we're not getting anywhere by acting like we're scared of words and scared of the conversation. I tell the same thing to pro-Palestinian activists. Why won't you let the Zionists in the room if you're so sure your ideas are right? And if we know that our story is the true story of the Jewish people and Israel and Zionism, we shouldn't be afraid when people are willing to have good faith conversations. We shouldn't be afraid to enter into dialogue and hear their ideas and try to help them hear our ideas. So in that way, I think we're looking in some respects at very different opportunities and dangers in terms of right-wing nationalists, white nationalists, and at least a portion of the anti-Zionism that bleeds into anti-Semitism.
So just to follow up, so I love what you're saying about education and conversation being a way to bridge between us and left-wing anti-Semitism. What about right-wing anti-Semitism? How do we tackle that?
I mean, I think there we have, the situation with right-wing anti-Semitism in this country in some respects is terrifying right now. And the reason I say it's terrifying is that where we have been successful in fighting right-wing anti-Semitism historically, we have worked very closely with law enforcement. We've worked very closely with the FBI. We have a federal government right now that refuses to condemn white nationalists. We have the Vice President of the United States was asked a question at the University of Mississippi a couple of weeks ago about whether or not Israel was shaping American foreign policy. His answer was, well, they're not shaping American foreign policy under this president, not rejecting the premise of that question, which was an anti-Semitic question, right? We know about Tucker Carlson and the sort of the struggle that's going on within MAGA right now about that. So, I mean, we have to find ways to work effectively with people who can actually root out plots and plans for violence or insurrection or sometimes militias that are on the right, because that's the lethal form that anti-Semitism is often taking from those people. So it may mean that the investment we make in security in our own community, which is already substantial, needs to be much greater, because if we cannot rely upon law enforcement to help us the ways that they often have historically with those dangers, we may have to invest in it more ourselves.
So I do want to add that my dad texted me during the plenary today to say that on Meet the Press today, the Republican representative from Kentucky outright condemned what Tucker Carlson had done and condemned Nick Fuentes. And I know that there are Republican leaders who are,
for sure,
who do have the moral courage to stand up and condemn what's going on. So I think that's an important thing to think about, despite what the missed opportunity by Vance.
Yes, no, thank you. And as Ambassador Shapiro said this morning, he and I would agree that we rarely agree with Ted Cruz, but we both have been very pleased by his recent rhetoric on this topic. So.
So I think I want to challenge the premise that we are in a situation of left versus right anti-Semitism, where, first of all, we're not naming the elephant in the room, which is Islamist anti-Semitism as well. And I think what we're seeing increasingly lately, I think the phrase red-green alliances, I think most people understand, right, at this point. But I actually think that we're in a place where we are seeing a red-green-brown alliance, because we see an increasing fusion of all these different kinds of anti-Semitism. And the anti-Semitism on the right that I'm really worried about, I mean, the far right, the neo-Nazi, white nationalism, etc., they are dangerous and scary, but they're still outside. I think that it's not hard to condemn them still. What's much harder for a lot of people to condemn, as we have seen, is Tucker Carlson. What's the name of? I'm forgetting. Fuentes, but also
Kevin Roberts.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So Candace Owens, that's the name I was reaching for. So the way I look at it now is that, and it's not my idea, I have to, I learned it from someone and now I use it because it really makes sense more and more to me. I look at it as, two concentric circles. So on the inside of the circle are those of us who still who adhere to the idea of liberal democratic, liberal democracy that we are all living in, right? So from the left to the right, but largely remaining in the center. And then everybody outside, kind of swimming in that outside circle, are all of the extremists. So it's really the center versus the extremists. And I think that the story that the extremists are telling, whether it's on the left, on the right, or on the Islamist part, is the same story. It's the story of Jewish power and evil, right? It goes back to that conspiracy theory. And so in some ways, rhetorically, I think, kind of in broad strokes, I think the fight is really the same. We're fighting against the very same tropes that have been used to defame and demonize the Jewish people for thousands of years.
So it's a very tricky problem with the Islamist anti-Semitism. So a couple of interesting facts. Bay Area CARE, or Executive Director Zara Ballou, at their recent fundraiser, said that one of her number one priorities this year is that when a Zionist is walking down the street, that they will be as shunned as a white supremacist. This is on Instagram. And she's not, and this has gotten out, she's not afraid of this. She's not taking it down. The other thing that's interesting is, and I don't know if we have enough time to get into this today, but there is a lot of Qatari money going into funding anti-Semitism, millions and millions of dollars being funneled into New York City public schools, to higher education across the United States and more. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about how we tackle this Islamist anti-Semitism, whether it's coming from abroad with Qatar or whether it's coming internally from CARE.
Well, I mean, it is a serious problem. And I think, first of all, Islamist anti-Semitic ideologies they're often mistakenly described as being on the left. This is ridiculous, frankly. There's an actual convergence between groups like Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood and the extreme right. There's a lot of commonality in worldview on women's issues, in worldview on a whole range of issues. And if you want to understand, years ago, I remember someone describing these groups as the religious right of the Muslim community, and that is a very useful frame. And so part of what we need to do is to actually completely reframe that problem in a way that will, I think, over time lead to those people who consider themselves progressive, who consider themselves against anti-Semitism, who somehow have become convinced that being progressive means being soft toward that form of anti-Semitism or having a blind spot for it. So that framing, I think, is crucially important. I do want to say, we had an allusion to it in the comedy routine this morning. Islamophobia, or whatever we want to call it, is a genuine problem on our campuses and in our country, and it's a serious problem that I've seen grow since October 7th. We're living, broadly speaking, among two very traumatized communities: our own community and those who have direct connections to Palestine, and often, by extension, Muslims who feel closely connected or have family connections, and who have often experienced discrimination or hatred in the last 2 years. So I think it's important for us to recognize that broadly for many reasons, but also on this specific issue. If we talk about the Qatari money, for instance, my university has very strong basic protocols around accepting or not accepting foreign donations. They're built into the whole process for how philanthropy to the university is considered. And so, we always hope for more transparency about donations, but the fact of the matter is they reject a lot of foreign money. I don't know what every university does, right? I know that the protocols differ tremendously. I also just want to say we have donors in our own community and connected to our own community who can be ruled out of bounds very easily. So I think these questions about donors are a very slippery slope and one to think carefully about. What I think matters by far most, and I tell this to my colleagues all the time with donors, is that there be a bright red line between the donor and the gift and what's going to be done with that, and that there be no ideological content connected to the gift, and that the donor not have enduring power to shape what's going to happen with the center, for whether it be a Center for Middle East Studies, an Institute for Israel Studies, or whatever. On a whole range of these issues, I think we need to be consistent. So I do think we should worry very much when there is real hard evidence of Qatari money that's being funneled for nefarious purposes, and we should go after it. But I also think we need to be careful not to sort of cry wolf about that, because first of all, we'll be taken less seriously when it is a real issue, and second of all, it can be connected to Islamophobia and to ultimately a set of ideas that can come back to haunt us vis-a-vis our own donors for our own programs.
Thank you, Ethan. Isabella, what do you think? What's the best way to push back against this Islamist type of anti-Semitism?
Well, I'm not sure I can give specific advice. I mostly, I'm much more familiar with the kind of anti-Zionism coming from the having just rejected the left-right binary, but that's the corner, let's call it that way. I think that I don't, by the way, see any issue with donors at least requesting that if we have a Jewish Studies Center, that it doesn't fall into the anti-Zionist language and propaganda, because we've seen too many examples when, a study, like an area studies center is usually established to study a country in good faith, right? Or it's Israel Studies Centers, to study a country or a region in good faith. To my knowledge, Israel Studies are the only programs that look increasingly, right, look at the subject of their study with disdain, and it's expected of them to look at Israel with disdain. And I know of too many donors who donated money expecting something completely different, and this is what they got. I think that something needs to shift in that balance, but I think that I don't see anything wrong with requesting that as an Israel Studies Center doesn't fall into this ideological kind of line. I think, one thing that did occur to me as I was thinking about it, I think we need to be making allies, and we need to be reaching to groups and allies that I think, and this is, I think, part of our problem, to groups that I think a lot of times the American Jewish community is hesitant to reach to because, there is a difference in overarching political perspectives, and Ethan just mentioned, so there are some Republicans, right, like Ted Cruz who have been doing a really good job. And I think it's very healthy for us to overcome our broader political commitments and recognize that when somebody is doing something good for us as a people, then we need to be thanking them. We need to be working with them. I see so much resistance to working with Christian Zionist communities. There's this strange longing in the American Jewish community for the people on the left, for progressives, to love us. And I just want to say, they don't love us. They left us. So why are we still looking after them? I've been making this couples parallel recently. It's it's like they found someone else, they went, why are we still staring in that direction? And there are actually others who are courting us over here, And then people say, well, the Republic, or whoever, conservatives, I hear this a lot, they won't be with you for a long time. Or if you think they won't betray you on a moment's notice, then you are being delusional. And I feel like, well, but you don't marry your ally. The ally is there to be with you in the current moment, in the moment when it's pragmatic alliance. This is what we need. And if that changes, if tomorrow their interests change, that's okay. We don't have to marry them. We can just date. And another area for us to look for allies, by the way, and I think this is something that we're really being complacent about and overlooking, is the middle of the country. We're really focusing on so much, and this is because I think so many Jews live on the coasts, and in the middle of the country, I think sometimes people just think, well, they're for us anyway. But we shouldn't be taking that for granted, because I think that, and this is where, the Islamist anti-Semitism and all of that, maybe it hasn't reached there yet, but it will. If we do nothing, it will. So I think, sometimes I think that rather than fight anti-Semitism head-on in the places that are really hard, we should go to places where people still will listen to us, right? Where they are willing to actually have conversations, where they don't have policies against normalization. So I think we need to be reaching into, to those institutions, those communities and campuses that are in between the coasts.
I love the metaphor of fighting anti-Semitism with allies and dating and marriage. I'm going to take that and use that with your permission.
Lori, is it okay if I just respond to that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ethan.
So here I think we do have maybe something of a strong disagreement. I'm all for us finding allies wherever we can, particularly in urgent situations. And we should recognize those even with whom we have strong disagreements, like Ted Cruz, when they speak up well on our behalf. But I think there's something deeper here that's harder that I think we have to be real about. I think the reluctance of large numbers of American Jews to get into bed with the right it's a values issue for a lot of people. It's a sense that there is a lot going on in the Republican Party that does not reflect the values of our community, that does not reflect long-standing Jewish political values, and that by allying ourselves there, we will be sacrificing those values. There is also a reality, if we want to talk about what does and doesn't stick, we are more vulnerable because of the alliance of some people in our community over the last 10 years with this administration and this Republican Party. We are more vulnerable today to being used as pawns in attacks on higher ed in America than we would be otherwise. Okay, I am the first to say that universities have opened themselves up to the attacks they're facing, that universities have made numerous mistakes, the universities have made themselves vulnerable to these attacks, and that there need to be course corrections. But I am also watching as Jews are being blamed for massive cuts in millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding, and those cuts are not targeted toward areas where there's anti-Semitism in universities, they're targeted toward medical programs, they're targeted toward wherever the federal government has leverage. We just should be honest about that. And the fact of the matter is that Jews are being blamed many times for those cuts. We are actually becoming more vulnerable, and we are being used at the same time by people saying that they are fighting for Jews while cutting all kinds of programs in, say, medical research that Jews, like everyone else, depend upon, right? So I just think that we have to, I'm not saying, there's no easy answer here. I'm not saying we have natural allies the same way that we thought we did for a long time on the progressive left, but I do think it's more complicated than simply saying, let's go date the people who want to support us now, because I think there are real costs.
You know, I just want to... So I want to add, and we had this conversation in our prep call, you know, on the attack on the universities, I do find it also very heavy-handed and cringe, but I also want to say that, you know, we'll be, it's like, we'll be attacked no matter what, and we'll be blamed no matter what. And I think that, you know, the attack on the universities by this administration looks very illiberal, but at the same time, the universities themselves are not liberal anymore. They have been taken over by an illiberal ideology. And so, you know, the question is, can the universities reform themselves? I was just last weekend, I was in a conference in DC with Middle Eastern scholars of the Middle East, and I was part of the panel where this question came up, you know, and there's just a really strong feeling that the universities will not reform themselves. They, for all kinds of reasons, you know, it's a question of power, it's a question of holding on to the positions that they have, certain people within them have acquired. I think that, you know, the ideologues have used the open system and the liberal system of the universities to acquire positions of power, and now they're not letting others in. You know, the playing field is really skewed. And so this is where, again, I think we have to just look at things in a more nuanced way. And yes, the people who will say they will fight on our behalf may not be perfect, and they never will be. But perhaps in many cases, it's okay. It's part of the complex reality that we live in.
It's a very challenging topic, and we dealt with this a little bit in our recent election with Prop 50 in California, where on one hand, the temporary redistricting adjusts for the gerrymandering in Texas, which is something that's important to do for fair elections. On the other hand, the redistricting in California then will likely remove several pro-Israel Republicans from Congress and potentially replace them, and from what I've seen who's running, with representatives who are not friends of Israel. So it's a very challenging dynamic. How do you vote your values? Where do you prioritize? We could probably talk for another 2 hours. We are quickly running out of time. I have one more question, and then I want to get to as many audience questions as I can. This one's a little bit of a visioning question. Each of you has spent years confronting anti-Semitism in different arenas. When future historians look back at this moment, what do you hope they'll say the Jewish community did, not just believed, to turn the tide against anti-Semitism?
Well, I think I really wish that people would look back and say that the American Jewish community, at a moment when, you know, at a moment when it was being told that Israel is not worth defending, or Israel, that they should divorce themselves from Israel. Here's my couple's metaphor again. You know, that Israel is a bad country, as the Masha Gessen just put recently in the New York Times, would actually say no and stand up and redouble their efforts to connect to Israel and bring more young people to Israel and bring more adults to Israel. I actually think it's a matter of survival, because again, it's about peoplehood. Remember that. It's about, right now, what's under attack is our peoplehood, the Jewish people as a whole. And so we need to be redoubling the effort to strengthening our ties with one another.
So I agree with all of that. But I would add that I think what I would hope is that we will be able to look back and say that in the process of fighting for security issues, we maintained our values. We maintained and only strengthened Jewish culture. We didn't feel that we had to do everything in the name of security in ways that we look back on and possibly regret. And I want to I already signaled, I think, the possibilities of dialogue across bitter divides on Israel and Palestine where there are opportunities. And I hope that we can look back and say we use that as a way to build bridges and build security. But I also think within our own community, we are facing, it's already been alluded to today, we're facing a crisis of bitter division within the American Jewish community. And there are many people who are deeply connected to their Jewishness, who are connected to their synagogues, to their JCCs, who I would imagine would be very nervous about coming to a conference where Zionism is going to be centered because they would feel that they were left out, or they would feel that if they said, I don't know what I think about Israel because I'm really upset about the war, that they would be told that they weren't Jewish enough, that they don't belong. And so I think figuring out how to have really hard and important conversations in our own communities that feel like genuinely open conversations that expand the tent as much as we can. And of course there are lines. Of course there are folks who only invoke their Jewishness to attack Israel. That is, in my view, something that really is super problematic for our community, and I understand why we keep those folks outside of the tent. But there are a lot of folks who are searching. There are a lot of folks who are afraid to ask the questions that are in their gut because they think they'll be told they don't belong. And so I also hope this will be a moment we can look back on and say we strengthened our unity not simply by having a unified message, but by opening real conversations in our community to build unity the hard way.
So that's a perfect lead-in to one of our audience questions. So as you probably know, 30% of young Jews in New York voted for Mamdani. So clearly we have some work to do with young Jews, helping them understand the facts on the ground and understand what it means to have a connection to Israel and how that will play out in their lives. So the question from the audience is, what do you think the role of Gen Z and Gen Alpha is when it comes to combating anti-Semitism and raising the next generation of safe and fulfilled Jews? Gen Alpha is the generation after Gen Z. So it's young Jews. Like, how do we help them? How do we enlist them in combating anti-Semitism?
Look, I think, it's a complex question. If we go back to why, I think there is a lot in why so many Jews in New York voted for Mamdani. I think it's truly complex. I think there's economics. I think it's the fact that I think the competitors weren't great, to put it mildly. I think, but I look at ideology and I look at kind of how people view the world. And what I do wish young Jews would learn, and not only Jews, but Americans in general, is that they would understand the danger of left-wing ideologies much better than they do. I wish people would be taught the history of communism and so the Soviet Union, because what I think we all see that people understand the danger of Nazism so well, but they really don't understand what is so problematic with the USSR. I have a friend who, whenever I used to give lectures, or whenever I give lectures about Soviet origins of contemporary anti-Zionist discourse, and she actually teaches high school students, and she says to me, look, I tell them about it, and they say, so what? What is the problem with that? What is the problem with this coming from a communist regime? So I think that there is a very important missing part of the story that our young people don't have. And I think we really need to fill that part of the story. And for Jews specifically, the story of how Jews suffered in those regimes and also how they fought.
Thank you, Isabella.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And connected to it, I would say, I know many young Jews who are for self-determination for all kinds of people around the world. They're for collective rights for all kinds of people, and they get very uncomfortable with the idea of talking about Jewish collective rights. They get very uncomfortable talking about Jewish self-determination. And we have to crack that code, and we have to just hold the mirror up to them and say, look, if you believe in self-determination for all these other peoples, why would you not believe in it for yourself? There's actually a very powerful Franco-Jewish thinker named Albert Memmi, who's not nearly as well known as he should be. He's part of a book that I'm writing on related topics. And he said very powerfully in the early 70s, he said, look, I've been a supporter of self-determination for all these people in North Africa and the Middle East. Why would I not be a supporter of that for my own people? So I think we really need to. And that brings us back to the fundamental principles and the fundamental story of Zionism, and telling that story in a way that this generation can relate to, and showing them where it aligns with many of their values rather than not.
So on that note, one final question. What gives you hope about the next phase of Jewish advocacy and solidarity?
So I'll just tell a few stories. My broad answer is that young people do give me hope despite all of the challenges we see on our campuses. And a lot of that hope I take from, first of all, seeing the incredible dedication and courage of young Jews across our campus in community building, in community solidarity, in creating community spaces, in asking hard questions, in supporting each other in the months and years since October 7th. These are students who are full-time students, and yet they really invested themselves very impressively, and they continue to. But I'll also talk specifically about the Bridging Fellowship and the students that I see there. We had a student who was from an Iranian family, Iranian Muslim family, and about halfway through the first year of the Bridging Fellowship, she wrote about how, everything I learned about Zionism before was from my father, who's very pro-Palestinian, and I had really no idea of what Zionism was about, and now I realize it means something very different, that being a Zionist doesn't mean supporting everything the Netanyahu government does, and that it has this really affirmative, positive value for Jews, and that was very eye-opening. And there's a number of other stories like that. But equally importantly, we had a student who was in Israel on their gap year on October 7th, extremely active Zionist, was told by numerous people, don't go to Berkeley, things there are crazy, you should find a new university, it's going to be terrible for you when you come back. Thought about it, stuck with his Berkeley acceptance, decided to wear a kippah on campus, and was ready to fight, was ready basically to encounter people who were going to make things really tough, but ready to stick up for Israel. And he talked about how the first time he went to a demonstration that was pro-Palestinian, he was ready to be scared and ready to be angry. And he said, I didn't feel either one of those things. I didn't like most of the things I heard. He said, but I didn't feel scared and I didn't feel angry. And I asked myself why, and I realized the reason is the skills that I've been learning in the Bridging Fellowship. And this year, on the anniversary of October 7th and October 8th, he wrote to tell me how he'd gone over to where the demonstrations were, and he heard people yelling at each other right away. And he went in and he introduced himself and he said, look, there's things we obviously really disagree about, but let's talk about what we have in common. Let's talk about what we want for the future. And isn't it amazing? He said, I spent about 4 hours over those 2 days in these conversations at the rallies. And I said, isn't it amazing all the things that we share, that we want for the future? And every time after those conversations, I shook hands and walked away and felt good. And the person who talked to me felt good. And he said, I think that people in our community just need to be more ready to listen. People in communities opposing us need to be more ready to listen. And when I see young people who have the courage and the strength to maintain their deep connections to Israel and to our community and to engage in these conversations and to make headway in these conversations by looking for what we share with one another, that gives me hope.
And we have dozens of them out on the side of the tent right now, which are giving me hope. Isabella.
Well, and it's very much for me as well. I think in this generation, we're seeing, in the book I tell stories of 6 young American Jews who, they all experience a moment at some point when, they go to college And none of them plan on being activists, not for Jewish cause. I think practically in all of the cases, they go to college and they think, great, I'm going to have a great time. Adela Kohav says, I'm going to go to NYU because I just love NYU. I've been bleeding purple since the age of 15. She literally says, as it's in the book. And she doesn't even want to live in the Jewish dorms because she says, my Jewish identity is already strong enough. I don't need to do it on campus. And then each of them experiences a moment, a burning bush moment when they cannot look away and they realize that they have to pick this up and they have to make it their struggle, and they do. And a lot of times they go actually against what mainstream campus organizations are telling them, which a lot of times say, don't get involved, don't promote, don't provoke, don't go over there, let the anti-Israel crowd be there, just walk on by. But they don't follow this advice. They go in and they provoke and they say things that then inspire others. And I think that the more we see what we see today, the more such students we will see. I think that we will see some young students or young people who do not want to be part of this, right? Who just want to live their lives. But there will be those who will feel that it is their fight and they will fight it. And that really gives me hope.
Right, and the more brave and courageous students who stand up and have those conversations, the more brave and courageous students will stand up and have those conversations. So, thank you so much, Isabella and Ethan. I have to close with two of my favorite Rabbi Jonathan Sacks quotes. The first is, "People respect Jews who respect themselves. And if we are united, no power on earth can prevail over us. We've got a tough road ahead, but we are a strong, determined, resilient people. Let's take what we've learned today and go out there and make a difference." Thank you, everybody.